American national government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 1, The Basics of Political Science. With this learning objective, we'll be considering the criticisms of American political system in terms of living up to the promise of democracy. Now, representative democracy in the United States both has a promise, but also there are fallacies associated with it. Now, the promise of American democracy is that there are fundamental individual rights that are inviolate and that citizens possess a universal right to participate in collective decisions. And these are reflected in the core democratic principles that we discussed in the previous lecture. Now, these principles provide a basis for judging the performance of American democracy. But the truth of it is, because humans are involved, no political system completely lives up to its ideals. There's always going to be a gap between the ideals and the political institutions that are designed to embody them. So let's take a look at those fallacies. Now, first of all, democracy promises the best policy decisions, but results in democracy are often untidy and confusing, and decisions which few are totally satisfied with. So the American political system is predicated on the idea that the majority should get what it wants, but the majority must ultimately be kept from depriving the minority of its fundamental rights. So the social conflict is caused by the representative institutions who occupy them is another one of these fallacies. But the truth of it is, it's not the institution's fault. They're only a reflection of the social conflict that is within society. And because we have so many diverse views and conflicting interests, they're oftentimes represented through the institutions themselves. So let's take a look at some of the challenges faced in American democracy and what they're based upon. They're based upon diversity and difference, the dynamics of change within society, ideology and partisanship of the individuals living in the society, and also the idea of false consensus that blinds people to the fact that there is conflict out there and there always will be. So first, let's take a look at diversity and difference. The American democracy has many different individuals with many different backgrounds, and you have to represent them in a democratic framework. Secondly, with dynamics, the conflicts that we see in democracy are shaped by a constantly changing backdrop. For instance, we've had incredible growth in the geography of this country over the past 200 plus years, from just 13 states on the eastern seaboard to include the entire continent, as well as Alaska and Hawaii. On top of that, the population has grown and reflected changing populations that have come in from other countries throughout the world with very different ethnic groups. At the same time, the income, while it has grown overall, also reflects that there is a divide between the very rich and the very poor. And you also have a divide between urban and rural individuals with different needs for different individuals in these groups. Additionally, gender roles have changed so that females have become much more involved within the political system and the economic system, and this is reflected in the change and the conflict that is currently going on within society. So, regardless of these things, within society we have to address it. So let's take a look at geographic growth and population growth. When we look at population growth in the United States just within 2 years, we see that some states have grown fairly subtly, but other states have grown to a great extent. For instance, we're looking at Nevada, which has grown by almost 36%, whereas Michigan actually has lost population. So taking this into mind and considering that there is a great deal of diversity within society, we have to address this within our political system. Now, one of the ways in which we deal with our political system is through the lens of ideology as well as the lens of partisanship. Okay, so what's the difference? Well, ideology is a consistent set of values, attitudes, and beliefs about the appropriate role of government in society. Now, most of the time when political scientists and psychologists and sociologists consider it, we consider it one dimension. But the question is it one dimension, two dimensions, or is it indeed multiple different dimensions? Now, when we think about it, we think about conservatives versus liberals, with conservatives favoring the status quo, and the idea that if there is change, it should respect laws and traditions of society. In other words, conservatives conserve society. Whereas liberals believe that individual liberty, with all the variation that it offers, is the most important value, and that people should be free to express themselves and live as they please, regardless of the laws and traditions of society. So these beliefs, while arrayed on continuum, provide endpoints of concern. Partisanship, for its point, is viewed as psychological attachment to a political party. And while certainly there is some congruence between ideology and partisanship, with, of course, conservatives being considered more Republican and liberals being considered more Democratic, the truth of it is partisanship is probably more akin to being a fan of a team than it is to any consistent set of values, attitudes, and beliefs. It's your team, right or wrong. So, if we're looking at change within the United States, we see that it's remained relatively stable over the last couple decades here. And ultimately, we see that conservatives and moderates, at least the self defining individuals, have remained stable and at around 40%, whereas those who consider themselves liberals, while growing subtly, is only about 20% of the population. Now, lastly, we're dealing with the idea of false consensus. And this is the idea that Americans tend to believe that their views are normal, or that they are common sense. In other words, it's shared by most people. But this is unrealistic and relatively uninformed view of politics and the democratic process. For instance, what is normal is based upon who you're surrounded by, and oftentimes that's self-selected. And if you don't move away from your community, whether you live in a large city and you stay within a very small community or live in a rural area, it oftentimes doesn't reflect the reality of this rather large and diverse country that surrounds us. Also, commonsensical, common sense is based upon the context you live in. If you live in different parts of the country, what is common sense might not be common sense in another part of the country. So let's talk about the reformance of democracy. First of all, there is the case for democracy, but then also major criticisms of American democracy. And lastly, we'll briefly touch on how politics is made sense of through political science, but that's the next lecture. So the case for American democracy is that it's a pluralistic political system. Here we see that the power is fragmented and distributed widely amongst diverse groups and interests. So, in other words, American democracy maintains the process of decision making by upholding the core democratic principles of majority rule, political freedom, and political equality. As a result, it produces outcomes that reflects these principles. But a criticism of this, indeed the major criticism, is that the American political system is elitist. In other words, we have organized, influential minorities that are checked neither by one another or by the general populace, dominate the political process. In other words, the argument is the United States is not a democracy, but is run by an oligarchy. And this leads us to the next question, which is how do we make sense of politics? Now, as political scientists, we are engaged in an ongoing endeavor to study the political systems and institutions and how the individuals within these systems make their decisions. And that was Chapter 1, Section 2 of American National Government.